I first came across the idea that there could be a concept of value and that could be something you could inquire into when I was gifted the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was 15 by a family friend. And I have to be honest, it didn't make much sense. The book's a sort of 70s counterculture novel / philosophy / motorcycle maintenance book. And actually, only much later did I come across the idea of value, which made a little bit more sense, which was that value was this economic thing, closely related to money, but not identical with it. And that sense of value is pretty different from the practical understanding of value that we have, which is something useful to us subjectively. And now, nobody wants a world in which money determines everything, but then the idea of getting beyond value as a concept of having a society which wasn't organized around value seemed kind of difficult. Like, I liked and understood politics, and it's hard to understand what value means politically or what its implications might be. Welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe in the UK. It's Thursday, the 18th of March, and I think we've all been in quarantine or lockdown now for a good year or so. And yet we continue, like some infernal machine, providing things of dubious quality or value to our listeners. Hi, George. Hi, Phil.
Hey.
Well, I think maybe, some of us produce more value than others in this podcast.
Is that because you work really slowly and so there's more labor time in what you do and therefore it has more value? Is that how it works?
That's a really lame inside joke. But no, it's not the way it works. It's entirely to do with the intrinsic merit and quality. In this case, anyway.
Yeah, nevertheless, we persist. Yeah, I don't know what the socially necessary labor time to produce a podcast is. It's not clear if it's socially necessary or not, but maybe it is. But yeah, anyway, today we are talking about value theory. I think this should be a really fantastic episode. We have some big topics to discuss, and I think the main challenge of the episode this evening is how do you link some of these kind of questions within Marxicology or Marxist theory to some really important contemporary political questions. But I think we have the right person alongside the three of us, obviously, to try to do this.
Yeah, and we're going to try not to be too Marxological about it. We know that not everybody will have read and studied Capital, for example, but some of this depends on certain concepts and terminology which will be found there, and we'll try to do our best to explicate those out when they come up.
Yeah, I mean, if the listeners have obviously their heavily annotated first volume of Capital, they should have that while they're listening along, just to make sure they can follow what we're talking about. No, I think it's, yeah, I mean, that's a challenge, obviously, isn't it? How you go from obviously quite a dense text, which is the foundation of these discussions, to talking about things which are a bit more widely applicable.
Yeah, and we're talking about pandemic, identity politics, and the sort of dead-end politics of our times as well. So something to get your teeth into.
Okay, great. So yeah, we're very glad to be joined this evening by Elena Louisa Lange. Oh, sorry, I should actually ask you how you pronounce your surname, because I mispronounce like every conceivable word that could be mispronounced. I will say with my terrible Anglo accent. So is it Lange or Lang?
Oh, please don't say Lange when you speak English. It's Lang when you speak English, and yeah, it's indeed Lange when you speak German. But I don't like these, German pronunciation in English. This is very ambitious. So it's perfect if you say Lang.
Lang.
It's like referring to it Farsi instead of Persian.
And it's uno kuzo, right?
Kozo, yes.
Okay. Cool. It's good. I mean, that just makes me sound like and it's Zurich, right? Okay. I've got it all in the bag then. All right, cool. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Elena Louisa Lange, who's a philosopher and Japanologist living in Zurich, and is author of Value Without Fetish, Uno Kuzo's Theory of Pure Capitalism in Light of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which is out in May with Brill. So yeah, Elena, great to have you with us.
Hi, friends. It's great to be here.
Cool. So just to kick things off, you had an excellent piece, which we'll link to in the show notes, with Joshua Pickett-Diapolis on COVID. And I think the title says it all: The Middle Class Leviathan, Corona, the quote, fascism, unquote, blackmail, and the defeat of the working class. So what's your take on COVID? What is this middle class Leviathan? And what does the analysis of this piece say about our current moment?
Yeah, so in the history of political philosophy, as you know, Thomas Hobbes, in the early 17th century, for him, the Leviathan was the absolute political sovereign. And what I'm trying to do in this article together with Joshua is to show how the middle class has now assumed this position. So there's kind of a new constellation that now everybody is at the mercy of a class that presents its self-interest as the interest of the oppressed, and only they get to define who is oppressed. So there's a kind of like a paradigm change. It's no longer the super rich elite that defines its interest as that of all, but kind of a new elite. And this is this middle class Leviathan. And now, who is this middle class Leviathan? It's of course the professional managerial class that you talked about before in your show, and media figureheads from the liberal left. In the UK, you have, people like Owen Jones and Novara Media, The Guardian. But in Germany, you have Der Spiegel, Die Zeit, you have state television. But even, I would say, also radical left-wing journals like Analyse und Kritik, they defend the middle class more than they do the working class. And in the United States, you have these archetypical middle class interest defending journals and media outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and so on. So what does the middle class Leviathan do? Or how can it be characterized? I think it can be characterized by its despotism. So over the last year, with regard to Corona, they really advocated tough lockdowns. So they advocated going tough on people who don't keep social distancing rules or wear masks. And this was all under the heading of to save lives, saving the NHS and so on. But what happened very suddenly in the end of May, beginning of June, and the Black Lives Matter protests, where there were no social distancing rules at all, we hear that protesting racism is more important than saving lives. And this thing, like going from one to the opposite, contradictory measures, that was really arbitrary. And I think this is a hallmark of despotic rule. And so what happened was that this anti-racism became a civil duty, but nobody really asked if non-whites actually profited from this moral gesture. And I would say that the whole political project of the middle class Leviathan is legitimized by this purely moral gesturing. And it's also tied to the replacement of politics proper with more or less moralistic concerns. And this is expressed more or less openly in identity politics, which is, at the end of the day, is just bad moral philosophy. So this is what I wanted to say. And Joshua had another point, which I think is really important, that the middle class, although it has class interests, it cannot have a political project of its own. So it's more like a sycophant that it attaches itself to the most dominant ideology, which in our time of a non-existent workers' movement is the ruling class, the capitalist class. And now the fascism blackmail is that when the horizon of political alternatives becomes so small that any shearing out of course of this moral gesturing, the moral framework, is labeled as fascism, And this is ironically happening at a time when there is no fascism as a political project to speak of. And we have this constellation, I think, because of historically unprecedented defeat of the working class and working class interests.
So, Elena, Alex, your question: why can't the middle class have its own political project? Because I think what would be traditionally understood as a middle class political project would be something like rationalization of society, or indeed even maybe making it more ethical, like, which would be more in keeping with the contemporary vibe. So I mean, not to say that I would endorse those politics, but there does seem to be the possibility, at least, of a middle class project, and that there's a certain continuity between, let's say, middle class politics of mid-century and today, in terms of trying to make smooth the edges of capitalism, I suppose, at least.
Yeah, but you see, I think you have to differentiate between the class interests of the middle class, which is to preserve the status quo. I agree with you, but that is not the same as to say it has a political project. A political project in a capitalist society either pertains to the capitalist class or the working class, and the working class has or should have, a political project. It has one that it isn't conscious of at the moment. It's a historical moment, and the capitalist has a political project. But the middle class can only attach itself to other interests. In this case, it would be the interests of the capitalist. It's also imaginable that the middle class, and this used to be the case, at least in Germany, in post-war Germany, the whole political discourse. I'm thinking about people I'm thinking about the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, was much more invested in working class interests, and this has virtually disappeared in the 1980s with the conservative revolution, the conservative turn under Helmut Kohl. So they don't really have a political project, and that of its own that had to be realized in a new entity. So the only thing they can say is they can do is attach themselves to something, to particular class interests, either of the capitalists or the workers.
So I think that leads nicely, that kind of contradiction of essentially having a class project but not being able to speak about it in that class's own name, and that's the situation that the middle class is in. That leads nicely onto another thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is that you're editing a collection called the Conformist Rebellion, that's framed essentially as a Marxist critique of the contemporary left, which apparently has a really great lineup of contributors. And I think we'll probably move to talk about some of the theoretical underpinning later when we talk about value theory. But politically, what's your analysis of the contemporary left? How does it come out of this point around, I guess, that contradictory position that the middle class finds itself in with relation to having seemingly captured the state but not being able to kind of speak a class project in its own name?
Well, first of all, the Conformist Rebellion is this edited collection that I'm editing together also with Joshua, which is out early next year. And so Joshua and I, we've been talking about various problems within the left, and we were feeling a deep dissatisfaction with the state of the left today. And so the biggest critique that we launched, or the most general terms, and the most general terms to put this critique, is that the left comfortably ignores Marx's critique of political economy and his analysis of capitalist relations of production as class relations. So that's something that doesn't happen so much anymore. And instead, the left, more or less, we address the academic left, but also the activist left, falsely reproduces the relation between capital and labor as that between, black and white, or women and men. And now, okay, some leftists say that their concept of race isn't identitarian, but I think this is even worse. Then it conflates class and race. But this is, this false reproduction is of a contradiction, of a basic social contradiction that we have in capitalism, which is falsely reproduced into something else. This is archetypical of ideology, as I would say, an objectively false semblance of an underlying essential relation, which is then reproduced as really existing. And this is quintessential about the left. This is a point I make also in the introduction to the volume when I talk about the subsumption of the concept of class into the trinity formula of race, class, and gender, as we find intersectionality theory and so on, which is, at the end of the day, is a mystification of the real relations. And I use this term trinity formula the same way that Marx has used the term trinity formula to criticize Adam Smith's concept of the three sources of revenue, capital, labor, and land, which is also a mystification of the real relation, which is also a mystification because it ascribes just as much power of generating wealth to capital and to land as to labor, when labor is the only source of value. Yeah. So there's a parallel I see in this mystification, and this is a critique that we launch. And one more point, maybe. Much of left theorizing completely ignores that social relations in capitalism are mediated by money. And that's why many leftists today, or even calling themselves Marxists, everybody calls themselves Marxists today, are in fact Ricardians. For Ricardo, money isn't really a factor in social reproduction. So this is also something we're trying to address in this book.
So a couple of points just to push you on a little bit. So the Conformist Rebellion, why is that the rebellion of the volume? Is itself conformist, or what's that? I guess what's the title hinting at?
The title is hinting at the preservation of the status quo, or even the accommodation of today's left to the neoliberal status quo. Precisely by integrating class relations or subsuming class relations to other social relations like race and gender, by no longer focusing on the primary position of the capital labor relation, they automatically attach themselves to we are right with the status quo right now, because as you know, this relates back to identity politics. Identity politics is not the only issue we talk about, but this is our vantage point. We have big chapters on other streams in the current left. We have one on Brexit. We have one on culture of art, on art and film, and how the left has completely forgotten about, or started to be more forgetful, I think, about the main contradiction in society, and So I guess the second point is it basically too simple then to say that this is a theoretical attempt to put classes central again, or to put the labor capital antagonism as central to the left, and so therefore to recover what the left could be? It's not too simple to say, and I have nothing against being simple here. I think this is we make a really straightforward intervention. There hasn't been so much intervention in this clarity, not that I know of, at least in the last years. There's been a book by somebody named Das on class, on the importance of class, but how many publications of the last 10 or 15 years in academic or trained leftism do you know that demand this kind of critique? Critique from the standpoint of labor, or the standpoint of not of labor, but of the abolition of real subsumption of labor under capital.
Can I just jump into to ask some clarifying thing? I mean, or rather, maybe to play devil's advocate, although I agree with you, Elena, I think many leftists and people who see themselves as materialists and not playing the essentialist identity politics game, nor the kind of maybe more postmodern one of, just pure play of identities, who would see themselves as fighting for working class interest, for working class advancement, and whose key term, I guess, or keyword that they follow would be inequality. And so although they're concerned with other oppressions, with gender and race, they're primarily interested in class and working class advancement. What you're saying is, I guess, critical of that, but I maybe if you could explain why those are different things, why concern with inequality is not the same as what you're saying.
Yeah, inequality is not the same as putting it like that. Addressing inequality or being interested in the problem of inequality isn't the same as being interested in class abolition. So this is also a Ricardian position we find in the left a lot: inequality. So the problem of capitalist production is not wrong kind of distribution, fairer or more just distribution of social wealth. This is not the problem. The problem is the social form of production that we find in capitalism. So this very social form is what I am trying to criticize and attack in my writings.
Great. Yeah, no, I think.
So what I want to say, this really goes into the value theory thing that we want to talk about. So maybe I can elaborate on that when we talk.
Yeah, no, I was about to make a somewhat similar point that I think that I guess the theoretical underpinning of some of these political interventions we can come to. But before we get onto that, just another final preliminary question. So just a little bit about your background and your research, because you had a career in the arts before you went back to school, as it were, and now research Japanese Marxism. I mean, it's rare that we have an expert in, I guess, Japanese Marxism on the podcast. So, and it's not very well known in the Anglophone world. So what's interesting about the development of Marxism in Japan?
Yeah. So to start off with my background, my career in the arts, well, I had a bit of a career in music in the 90s and early 2000s in the German indie music scene, which was more or less a subculture of a subculture, but which was also my political education. And all this time I studied philosophy and Japanese studies. I wrote my PhD. And that was all before Marxism, before I got interested in Marxism. My upbringing was pretty Marxist-Leninist, so I rebelled against that by reading Frankfurt School theory. And
wow, that's quite rebellion.
that was quite rebellion.
Tell us, Elena, what was the political education in the music scene, on the music scene?
That was really interesting because after the reunification of Germany in the 1990, and I was pretty young then still, but the people I played music with later, they were all in these Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, social mutual aid, I think it's called in English. These little, they were very politically engaged and playing a lot in Eastern Germany. And then what happened in the 90s were very, very political in Germany, and danger of new nationalisms, and then the first war of aggression from Germany in 1999, and the NATO aggression against, then Yugoslavia. And this is where I was radicalized, and a lot of people I know also in this music scene were radicalized, or in the art scene more generally. And then the war in Iraq, and the question of imperialism. Then there were the anti-imps, the anti-imps, as we called them, and the anti-Deutsche, as we also called them. And they had constant fights among themselves, which were very, educational in a way for me. I was quite young, but I followed all, and I tried to participate in this kind of they made no prisoners, when they were discussing, and we were hanging out in bars, and talking all night long about these things.
The anti-Deutsch are a very, very specific and peculiar, I suppose, group on the left in Germany specifically. I wonder, perhaps you could tell us very briefly about what the anti-Deutsch stand for? Just anti-imp, I suppose, is fairly straightforward in that anti-imperialism is familiar across the Western left. I think people will know what it means in their own context if they're familiar at all with left politics, whereas anti-Deutsch is slightly more specific.
Well, the anti-Deutsche formed themselves as a reaction against the peace movement, actually, against the anti-imperialists who were anti-Americans, more or less. You could just say that. And especially during the first Iraq War and then the second Iraq War. And the anti-Deutsche did everything in reaction to the anti-imps or anti-imperialists, and they were extremely, well, as the name says, anti-German. Anything that where there was a initiative by Germany to go forward in this or that direction, that was equaled with fascism. You know, they want the Third Reich back. That was what the anti-Deutsches said. And this danger of renazification was seen everywhere. I think they exaggerated in some points, but some of the political theory was really, really good. So they were, there's this little publisher in Freiburg, Saira, and they do amazing stuff. And they also published a lot of value theorists, and like Hans-Georg Backhaus and so on. So they were Marxists who were deeply influenced by Adorno and Frankfurt School of Critical Theory more generally. And they were extremely intellectual. They're very, very serious people, very earnest people, almost to the point of fanaticism, I would say. But not everything they said was totally bonkers. So sometimes the way they are described or depicted in forums and social media is just wrong.
So in terms of Japanese Marxism, which is how we started this part of the conversation, how did you get interested in that, and what do you think's kind of valuable or interesting about Japanese Marxism specifically?
Yeah, so I studied Japanese philosophy. I did my PhD in Japanese philosophy before doing any Marxism, but then I lived in Tokyo for a time, and I came back to Germany, and then I went back to Japan to really pursue my interest in Marx and in Marxism. And what's interesting about Japanese, I wouldn't say Japanese Marxism, it sounds somehow culturalistic, but maybe Marxism in Japan, is they have really highly developed debates about value theory, even from the post World War II period. Because Japan really stood in the shadow of the Cold War. It was really something, that was reckoned with during the Cold War. So the academics, they could pursue their studies of Marxism, and they did so with a real vigor, which was really interesting to me to read these texts from the 1940s, 1950s. But ironically, it was the US occupation that brought back Marxism to Japanese high schools and universities. So what's interesting about Marx in Japan, that Marx was is read at economics departments and not philosophy or cultural studies. That's I think that's the biggest difference.
So how did
that
the
is
US
quite different to
occupation,
the Anglophone world.
How did the US occupation import Marxism?
That was because, as you know, that during the era of ultranationalism in the Pacific War, Marx was forbidden, of course, and the Communist Party was suppressed and so on. But and the US occupation brought back all the things that were suppressed during this era, during the ultranationalist era. And they said, yeah, Marx is, read some Marx. If you read Hegel or Kant or Hobbes, why don't you read Marx? And they opened the schools again and said, here, you got the books, do what you want with it. And so Marx was widely read in Japan before that, but it was the U.S. occupation that encouraged universities also to read Marx, not because they thought they thought it was a part of the canon, so they brought it back and said, yeah, do it, and the Japanese did it.
Liberal education, huh?
Yeah, and to me the interesting thing is that you can be a Marxist today in Japan and be employed at a university and at the economics department. This is something that is completely unimaginable in Europe or the United States.
So presumably that's entirely, a bad thing, right?
Yeah. But he's not, Marx is not understood as just as a philosopher, or, somebody who said the thing about the philosophers have just, interpreted the world, the points to change it. No, he's really a capitalist being widely read. And I did some workshops there, did some talks in Japan, and the people are really into it, even young people. So that was really refreshing. Is
there any way that you could maybe say differentiate? I know you were reluctant to say Japanese Marxism, but say, we're familiar with, say, I don't know, we might think of Russian Marxism, connected to Lenin and the Bolshevik tradition, Italian Marxism connected to Gramsci. If you had to identify something that was distinctive and important about the Japanese contribution, what would you say it might be?
Well, there's the activist Japanese left, and then there is theoretical Marxism. I think theoretical Marxism is more interesting, and there's this figurehead, I think, even of Marxism in Japan when it comes to economy. We're talking about the economy critical Marx here, and that is Uno Kozo, and he has formed his own school in post-war Japan. And it's not so much, it is actually not a political invention at all, but he tried to systematize Marx in a very specific way, which then became very influential, also internationally. So it's interesting to have such an elaborate level of theoretical Marxism and so many well-read Marxists in Japan, but virtually no activist Marxist left in Japan. So you couldn't really compare it to the Russian Revolution and trajectory in Italy or in France. I think that would be very difficult. Well, the 1968 movement was the student movement was very active, and there's just this one thing I remember from reading those texts, that the Situationists, De Boer and so on, they were in fact influenced by Japanese Marxists at that time, the Japanese student revolts. But that is the only thing I remember.
It's interesting. I mean, I growing up in Europe, I guess, and spending my 20s in Europe, I had this kind of assumption that, Marxism is Marxism, it's universalist, it's international, and therefore it's kind of the same everywhere. And that you might have different contributions from people in different places, but that the basic questions remain fundamentally the same. And I think my experience in Brazil is that actually, no, the fact of being in a different situation actually brings to the forefront different questions, that there's. So firstly, I want to ask, is there a particular, my thinking is with regard to Brazil, that the specific conditions of Brazil and the failure of development, the failure of modernization is a central question of Brazilian Marxism, I suppose. Whereas in Japan, I guess it would be different because, Japan did become part of the core capitalist countries. So firstly, is there a central question that is kind of distinct about Japanese Marxism, which would be different from what people would be familiar with in the UK or Germany? And also, is there anything that you would recommend to people if they were interested in learning a little bit more about it, where to start?
Yeah, well, this Brazilian Marxism question isn't so different from the Japanese Marxism question. There was a huge debate in the 1930s in Japan about the character of the Meiji Restoration in 1868. When the emperor was reinstalled, as the sovereign of the state, and when the feudal relations were abolished. And so this big debate in Japanese Marxism was whether this Meiji restoration was in fact a bourgeois revolution that introduced capitalist relations of production to Japan, or whether this was a reinstallation of some kind of pre-modern feudalist institution.
Right.
And so there was the Communist Party Marxists, the Koza, they had this theory of Ichidankai Kakume. This is the one-step revolution. So they said there has to be a two-step revolution. First was the reinstallation of the emperor, which reinstalled feudalist relations. But then you needed a real, true socialist revolution from that. And then there was another faction, the so-called Ronoha, which was the laborers and the peasants. And they said, no, this is already a bourgeois revolution in the perfect sense, and we only have to go to a true revolution from here. It's just a one-step revolution. And then the whole character of the debate was shaped because of the question is why is Japan a backwards country, or how can Japan keep up with competition on the world market and so on. So they asked this question, how asked, should Japan be integrated in the world market in order to overcome these relations?
So in terms of an introductory reading for our listeners, if they're interested in following this up, but before moving on to value theory, is there one or two things that they could follow up?
There's a really good book by Germaine Hostin. She is, I forgot which university she's at, but she wrote a really good book on Marxism in Japan, where she goes into detail of all the participants in the debate. So if you Google Germaine Hostin, I forgot the title of the book, but it came out in 1985, and it's still, I think, the best recapturing of this debate in the 1930s.
Cool.
And we'll include links in the show notes for listeners if you're interested in chasing that up.
Cool. So on to value theory. So because your new book is about this very topic, Phil.
So I wanted to ask you about the significance of value theory, Elena, and particularly partly of my own personal background, because I remember a phase perhaps about 5 to 7 years ago, and there was this whole proliferation of reading groups by various leftists for Marx's Capital. I'm sure at least some of our listeners passed through it. And if they did, they'll probably be familiar with some of these questions. And at the very least, they'll know that these questions of what the theory of Marx's labor theory of value is, the meaning of the value form, they're not only difficult, but they can also appear downright esoteric or even hermetic. So could you explain to us, why is it important to have a grasp of value theory?
Phil, I'm very happy to answer this question. So first of all, maybe my book is indeed about value theory, but it's more essentially a debate between Marx's critique of political economy, and I sometimes prefer to use the term critique of political economy, which I sometimes use synonymously with value theory, and Uno Cosa's rather functional theory of pure capitalism, which I think fails to address the problem that Marx addresses, even on the level of the theory of value. So now, why is value theory important? So on a more general level, I would say without value theory, I think it becomes very difficult to understand the workings of capitalism. And more importantly, the fetishisms it creates to keep itself out of the picture. So for example, exploitation. Exploitation is not just exploitation. Behind the problem of exploitation is a question. And the question is, how can unequal exchange be explained on the basis of the law of equal commodity exchange? Then one needs a concept of value for that to explain exploitation. One needs a concept of socially necessary labor time for that. If you don't have that, you cannot explain how unequal exchange between capital and labor is possible on the basis of equivalent exchange. Another thing, money. Without value theory, it's very difficult, I think, to explain what money actually is and why capitalism without money is unthinkable. Unless you have a concept of value as abstract labor. This is something that is, I think, going to be very difficult to explain. And even, in the modern monetary theory and so on, there's no reference to abstract labor, to money as abstract labor at all. And also, if you don't have value theory, then how are you going to explain the production of poverty on an increasing scale? You need the general law of capitalist accumulation, which is based on theory of value. And then I think you also have a hard time explaining inherent crisis tendencies of capitalism. The falling rate of profit can only be explained on the basis of value and surplus value as the structuring mechanisms of contemporary capitalist society. So these are all things that you need value theory for.
Yep.
So, I guess to dig a little bit deeper and maybe also to kind of simplify it, especially for people who maybe haven't read much Marx or any Marx, or certainly haven't studied at least kind of volume 1 of Capital, because I think there's a risk of seeming like, okay, if you understand these complicated words, then somehow the world will be revealed. I guess what's the nucleus of this idea? What's the, what is value theory a theory of, I guess?
Yeah, this is a great question. Oh, sorry, were you finished?
Yeah, I was going to say more, but I thought, no, I'm going to let you explain and then I'll come back.
Yeah. No, thanks. This is a great question. And indeed, as I said before, and this was a bit just, as an aside, but it's about fetishism. It's about explaining the illusions of capitalist society. You don't have to understand complicated concepts, but what I think is very useful to understand is the historical specificity of the social form of labor that produces value. Because value theory is the theory of the social form of labor in capitalist relations of production. And if you understand that this is historically specific to capitalism alone, then you understand a lot. You understand that this is wage labor that receives a monetary wage. You understand that labor, it's the kind of labor that produces quantifiable units of value, which are always measured in money. This is also historically specific. And you understand that this is a kind of labor that is not aimed at producing use value. It is not aimed at the satisfaction of needs. So with that framework, you can address a lot of problems that are happening, or things that are occurring in our historical time. And the question that interests value theorists is this question of fetishism. So why does labor and capitalism always assume the form of value, the value form as money, predominantly money? So it is only because in this way, as quantification of labor, as quantification even of life, that capital can relate to itself as capital. But the thing that's happening here, and the thing that really interests me, and which I talk about in my book at length, is in the concepts of money and capital and these value forms, even in price, the relation to labor is completely obscured. This is the fetishism that's happening, and that's why we need a labor theory of value, because it defetishizes, it demystifies these concepts of political economy. And so, it also explains how these concepts become disentangled from the expenditure of human labor and become fetishisms.
So, I guess I'm going to maybe do a bad job of summing this up, but, if capitalism is a global machine for the production of value, which it extracts from living labor, and then it gets circulated around, that's something that you find in Marx. What is distinct, or what is, why does value theory need a name, which is value theory and isn't just Marxism that we all know? Or to put this in a different way, what would be your criticism, I guess, of other, many forms of Marxism which overlook or ignore the things that you think are important in value theory?
Yeah, well, so most of the so-called Marxist theorists that I read, even like political Marxism, Robert Brenner, they used to have an excellent analysis, but they completely disregard this problem of fetishism. So they treat the commodity and money and capital and prices of production and profit and rent and interest, all these concepts that make up, the concepts of political economy. They treat them as at face value, and it would be interesting, or the duty would be to explain what they have got to do with the exploitation of unpaid human labor. And it would be important to explain how they become autonomous, these concepts. Interest-bearing capital. What is this thing, interest-bearing? Why does capital bear interest? Is it like a pear tree that bears fruit? This is something that Marx says. So the crux of the matter, you say, is what's happening is a naturalization of these concepts, even in Marxist theory. And there is no longer problem consciousness, I would say, to this whole complex of fetishism that Marx addresses, and which culminates for Marx in the critique of this trinity formula. Even of course, obviously, in non-Marxist economics and marginalism, you have this idea of the factors of production and so on. And but sometimes, and this is what I address in my book, sometimes even Marxism verges into this terrain of marginalist economics. So I didn't really initially want to talk about this, but since you asked me, Alex, there are a whole bunch of Marxists who say that value is constituted in exchange. And Michael Heinrich, he used to be very ambiguous on this point, but this is something that he would say. He'd say value is something that is not entirely confined to production. It is also, value is something that's also constituted in exchange. And this is not a Marxist position. This is not Marx's position, but many Marxists have taken over, I would say, have steered into this terrain of neoliberal economics, more or less.
So, I mean,
this is something
practically, that would be something like the idea that you have productive labor, stuff that actually produces value. And, you're classically thinking about a factory, probably, a Foxconn factory in China, probably take the kind of most obvious example today. And then you have this other idea, which you disagree with, which is that value is created through exchange, through finance, perhaps, which you'd hold that doesn't actually create new value.
But this is a fetishism. This is what Marx addresses in Capital as a fetishism. He says even as early as the fifth chapter of the first volume of Capital, Marx says the exchange of commodities, circulation or the exchange of commodities does not create value. And a lot of self-described Marxists disagree with that. And so there's this Marxist economist who used to be a politician, actually from the Netherlands, Gerd Ruijten. He says there is no such thing as value before the commodity enters the market. And then there's Michael Heinrich, there's Gerd Ruijten, there's Chris Arthur, there's a whole bunch of, maybe to your listeners, quite obscure theorists, but which all get a mention in my book.
I guess just to maybe move this a step forward into the political stakes of some of these discussions, because I think they are, obviously the interpretation of these concepts is from Marx's work is really interesting and important. But there's another question as to what I guess what is riding on this, so maybe to move this on to the critique of identity politics, which you've advanced, because I think that would be the really interesting point to see how these things link together, and to simplify massively, there a critique of identity politics which sees it as an expression of PMC class interest. So basically the idea that there are certain, I guess, to put it quite bluntly, there are certain class interests which are furthered by the battering ram of identity politics. But how would the critique that you would put forward be different from that, which is essentially a quite an instrumental one, that people don the clothes of identity politics when it suits them, and then discard them later when they've achieved what they want to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, identity politics as representing the class interests of the PMC is okay. I mean, it's maybe one aspect of you can address it as one aspect of the more general critique that value theory would have. I think I find it really interesting that you would say value theory, a value theoretical critique of identity politics. I've never thought about it in this way, but what are the stakes of the problem, or how would value theory address this identitarian? It's more a philosophy, I would say, or a moral philosophy. I think that value theory can actually show that this ominous class reductionism that's always been talked about is not a theoretical position of a certain thinker like Marx, but it's a reductionism performed by social reality. And this is what value theory can really show. And this is a big, yeah.
Yeah, no, what do you mean by this? Because I think this is right at the center of it.
Yeah, I think this is a really big game changer in the epistemological stakes of the problem. So class reductionism is really not a question of thought. It's not a question of a theoretical position that somebody assumes, but it's a question of an actually performed abstraction, a real reductionism that happens because this is what happens because individuals are subsumed to their class position, which really takes place every day through the wage and the money dependency, you know. And what I mentioned before about quantifiable units that labor produces, not just the commodities are quantifiable, and everything that is produced under capitalism as a use value is quantifiable as a value, but human life itself, you know, is subjugated, I could almost say, to this law of value, to this reduction to class and reduction to one's dependency on wage. And this goes for workers as well as capitalists, I think. And this is something that value theory has shown. Historically, it's already been formulated in Frankfurt School. Theorists, Alfred Schmidt has to be named here, who says that this economism, that is always lamented, you know, in these, it's just a pure economism. How can you? But this is not a theoretical position. This is a socially performed abstraction.
So to maybe get a bit more specific here, because I think there's kind of linking some of the problems with the contemporary left around this trinity that you spoke of earlier. One example that I know you've written on before is the work of Assad Haider. So what's your political disagreement with his work?
I'm not so much interested in Assad Haider as a person. I use him more or less as a stand-in for the academic left at the moment. So it's not against Haider per se, but the trained leftists he represents. And I think he represents this stream I talked about earlier of the trinity formula, you know, as race, class, and gender are all equally important, and we need cross-class democratic struggles against capitalism. You can't just have the workers' movement, you know. This is, I think, a stream that Haider represents, and this is a point he makes very clear in his critique of Adolf Reed. And this is what I dealt with when I wrote my article on him. So what I would say about Haider is, at a more general level, that he doesn't understand class reductionism, as I said earlier, as a socially performed abstraction. It's not an abstraction in the mind of a theorist. So Haider thinks that Adolf Reed thinks that one should assume a class reductionist position. So Haider also really doesn't have a concept of the contradiction between capital and labor. Really, I couldn't find that in his work so far. And he even says, if I remember correctly, he says that with the development of the forces of production, that labor is not more and more subsumed under capital and real subsumption, but less. And there's with the development of forces of production that labor can free itself from this from the fetters of capitalism. This is a really strange way to phrase this development. So, and then he makes this point, which is, I think, central to his writing. He says that the notion of class flattens the meaning of diverse struggles, and he says we need to broaden the struggles. I think this is nonsense. I mean, how does class flatten or narrow the meaning of struggle when the struggle of labor against capital would be the only adequate and general expression of I would say, virtually everybody's interest. The wage dependency is universal. And even for unemployed and so-called surplus proletariat, we cannot understand why there is something as a surplus of people if we don't understand that this surplus is produced by the needs of capital to appropriate as much surplus labor as possible through the wage form. How can you say that we need to broaden the struggles? These people always want to broaden struggles and exclude class.
Presumably the argument would be that the broadening is required because some struggles are experienced through the lens or through the lived experience of gender, the lived experience of race, and so there is a need to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say about that, because also his concept of race is mythologist. So he says something that is very popular also in this scene is that race is just a social construct. This may even be true, but then for him and for other theorists, it also has a material reality. And then race then becomes this Platonic ideal according to which reality is structured. And then everything is gendered, everything is racialized. There becomes this absolutism. And what I find really worrying when I read this theory, and Heidegger is by all means not the only one who puts it in these terms. If you read Marxist feminism, there's a lot of the authors who collapse the normative and the descriptive into one. They purportedly describe a certain reality. Everything is gendered, work is gendered, private life is gendered. If you go on the street, all of that is gendered. And if you say, well, then do something about it or change it or criticize it. No, we have to first of all view reality in this way. And this is, I think, really problematic. It becomes very Platonic in some way, Platonic realism. But even more important than that, is that I think Heidegger, as many other people, he doesn't really understand the difference between oppression and exploitation, and that reflects back into his theory. So what happens effectively in his work, at least in this critique of Adolf Reed, he inverts the ideas and the really existing entities. So he inverts ideas like race into really existing entities, and really existing entities like class into ideas.
So just to jump in there, what is, like, in one or two sentences, actually maybe a few more than that, the distinction between oppression and exploitation?
Well, I would say oppression is not historically specific to capitalism. That's something that you have more or less any kind of society, of human society we had in the history of mankind. It's non-specific, and it can be based on racism and sexism and so on. But it's not the same as exploitation. Exploitation is a very specific economic relationship in which that is based on the appearance of formal commodity and equivalent exchange, which is in fact only possible on the basis of wage labor. So this historically specific term of exploitation based on wage labor is not the same as oppression, which doesn't even really need an economic expression.
So I wanted to connect some of these questions of value theory to other kind of ongoing questions as well, which is specifically the pandemic. So you've written about the myth of objective constraint, and it would be interesting to hear if you could explain a bit more about what you mean by this idea of objective constraint, the myth of objective constraint, and why you think it's so relevant, perhaps particularly to the circumstances of lockdown.
Yeah. So the objective constraint is nothing else but this fetishism we talked about before, where the social and the natural properties of a phenomenon are inverted, in fact. So the way that you cannot see what money has to do with labor, and just a purely social expression of relations between people. You cannot see, and it's no longer possible to see what corona and this whole phenomenon of the virus has to do with the social phenomenon. So corona is confronted solely as a natural thing, and I say there's nothing natural about it. Not even the source of origin is very natural. If you look at the organization of these, of these markets in China, where it purportedly came from. So corona is not a natural, but a social phenomenon. Then if that is the case, then hospital bed shortages are also purely social. And this argument of saving lives to reduce demand for the health system is very hypocritical. Imagine what states can do when banks fail. This is something that's said in this article. And the point is this: capitalism is not a supply and demand economy. This is really important to say, because it would seem, if you say it's a supply and demand economy, that what is produced in capitalism are use values. And yes, use values are being produced, but they are only produced because they are the bearers of value and surplus value. There is no other reason that use values and commodities are being produced. You have to correct the sentence and not say capitalism is not a supply and demand economy. It's a supply and moneyed demand economy. There is no social mediation without money. And this is why this talk about corona as an objective constraint is so hypocritical, because ultimately it's a question of money. It's not a question of life and death and natural properties, but it's a question of money.
I just have a kind of a provocative thing to put forward, but I think I've made this point on the podcast before, which is anti-lockdown people naturalize coronavirus just as much as pro-lockdown people. And the reason for that is that it doesn't suggest any real politicization of what happened, both in terms of the creation of the virus, but much more so in terms of states' actual preparation for it, the way that they have mobilized, or in fact not mobilized, people to respond to it. So in some sense, also the anti-lockdown people say, well, lockdowns are bad, there's negative consequences. Okay, we can all agree with that. And that basically the struggle should be taking place over whether you're pro-lockdown or not pro-lockdown, which also just accepts that the virus is there and that society is at its mercy, and that it's a natural phenomenon. And I mean, I see it in Brazil very much, where the anti-lockdown people are all the far right, who also are totally happy with naturalizing it and actually not very fussed about whether people die. And so I think what's important in terms of politicizing it is precisely to take it off the terrain of, whether you're pro or anti-lockdown, but actually really inquire into and politicize what actually happened rather than the emergency responses alone.
No, I totally agree to that. I mean, I'm not saying that the right-wing anti-lockdown militants have a deeper understanding of capitalist relations of production. That's not what I'm saying at all. It would be really strange if they had this insight. Because they never had it, but that's the whole point. I mean, they never had it, and I wouldn't expect it from them, but I would expect it from those, educated and enlightened people who tell me, they know how capitalism works, and that's I found this disparity between, on the radical left, among Marxists, even saying, the profit postulate is it's an objective constraint, it's ideological, But when it comes to Corona, suddenly nobody makes that argument anymore on the left, and that disparity is just more striking to me than the anti-lockdowners who also don't have an understanding of the social character of Corona.
Great. Yeah, I agree. So to move it on, I think, and kind of, I guess, back to value theory more explicitly, is there a broader politics to value theory? Because I mean, my reading of value theory is not that extensive. I've been reading a bit of Robert Kurtz recently, and one thing that strikes me is who's very popular in Brazil, actually. And in fact,
I know. Me too. I have have an article in Brazil about value theory in Portuguese. Yeah.
Oh, excellent! I'll have to check that out. But yeah, in terms of spelling out the politics of value theory, I mean, it seems to be in some ways beyond political. I mean, that in some ways it wants to not engage with capitalist politics at all, which would be resolutely revolutionary. But not just that, but it seems to go beyond what we understand as revolution. Certainly, in terms of the model of the Russian Revolution or other supposedly communist revolutions. In that, and I guess to be specific, is that it rejects the standpoint of labor. So it's not about us working class who work and create value and the parasitic capitalists who suck off all this value from us, but it's about getting beyond that itself. So I'm interested in what that looks like politically, or indeed maybe it's not even politics.
Yeah, interesting. So it is indeed not a standpoint it's not a critique from the standpoint of labor against capital. This would be something like the Russian revolutionaries did, criticizing, empowering labor, something like that. Value theory would rather be a critique of capitalism from the standpoint of the abolition of labor, from the abolition of class, and the politics of value theory. Well, does value theory engage with capitalist politics at all? Well, it does. The question is, what do you mean by capitalist politics? It certainly engages with capitalist economics and political economy. That's why I always say value theory is essentially the critique of political economy. And in that sense, it's of course a critique of current capitalist politics as well, And but I think what's really more important here, and more trenchant maybe, is that if you have a fetishism critique at the core of politics, this is what value theory I think provides, then a lot of things become clearer. Also on the question of domination. Now, as Marx said, the capitalism is the mode of production in which the production process has mastery over man, instead that man has mastery over the production process. And the point of this politics of value theory would be exactly to have to get back control, so to say. This is a very maybe a stereotypical way to phrase it.
Sorry, did you say get back control?
Somebody should use that as a slogan. That's not a bad slogan right there.
Yeah.
Well, to be no longer at the mercy of these fetishisms that create our reality.
Can you give us like an example of what would be a fetishized politics, and then what would be the value theoretical response to that?
What are the top 5 fetishisms? And
I can tell you, it's the commodity, it's money, it's capital, it's profit, it's interest and rent. No, but seriously, so this objective constraint is a good expression. I think that, of course, when we talk to economists or even politicians, they say, well, we are in a competitive society, so what are you going to do about that, right? So it is as though truly, as Frederick Jameson had said, we could it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, And this is a fetishism, the valorization postulate. Then what else is a fetishism? That the climate will kill us all, and the debates surrounding the climate change and environmental issues, and then of course. Corona itself is a kind of fetishistic expression of underlying, contradictions and problems and fetishisms. So these are, I would say, if you ask me straight away, what are the top fetishisms, I would say it's them.
So, given the ease with which we can imagine the end of the world, either through climate or not so much nuclear war anymore, but coronavirus, and also the state of the left today, mired in some of the fetishisms that you mentioned, and probably many other problems as well, and also the predominance of the PMC leviathan that we talked about earlier. This has almost become a kind of a cliched question to end the kind of discussions that we have with guests, but I mean, are there any reasons for optimism? It would be great if you could just give us some quick wins or some low hanging fruit, or I'm trying to think of some other terrible phrases to use. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question, right? Like, how do you flip this analysis into some kind of practical? I was going to say praxis. I can't think of another word to finish that sentence, so I'm just going to pass it over.
I mean, I'm really bad at that. I'm really bad at giving, now what are we going to do about this? Give us some, some.
Yeah, give us some easy answers.
Come on, this is like whenever I give a talk at a conference, this is exactly the question every time I get asked every time. So, but I think we need a more rigorous theory to change it. So stop making concessions to liberals. That would be very, very useful to lift the debate to a different level, where as leftists or as Marxists, we stop making these concessions to liberal politics. That would be very much, that would be worth something, I think. And if we don't want the 21st century to pass us by, we need to start, a revolutionary strategy that is truly in the interest of the liberation from real subsumption and in the interest of the working class. That's what I think. And I know it sounds very general, and you're not going to go outside and have a revolutionary strategy tomorrow, but maybe the day after tomorrow.
Excellent. That's a great place to leave it, I think.
It's a great line
for the day after tomorrow. All right. Thank you so much, Elena.
Thank you too. It was a pleasure.
No, it was great. I think when the Conformist Rebellion book comes out, which will be probably a year and a half from now, it'd be. But cool
George, we should have really said that you are a contributor, don't you think?
No, you want people to hold it in high regards.
He tried to indicate that with a lame joke. I think people.
But he didn't lay it on thick enough, so he just said they're fantastic contributors. But it wasn't clear that he was complimenting himself.
Fantastic contributors. Some of these contributors,
including myself,
they're really great. They're really fantastic. We've got some really fabulous contributors.
the best,
the absolute best. No, I should have laid it on. Yeah. I bottled it.